Okay,
Hey everyone, I'm Brooke,
I'm Mac.
and we both did public forum in high school, and we now participate in APDA, American Parliamentary Debate.
And so we're going to give you some tips on what the difference is between the two activities, why APDA is undoubtedly superior in our minds, and why it's fun to do, and why you should try to invest in doing it in college, regardless of what school you go to. Cool. So first, I'm recording. Yay. Um, we're just going to start with a classic standard PF round that everyone knows and loves. I'm just going to arbitrarily assign like neg to be first and af to be second. This is obviously one configuration of a PF round that could occur. And I'm not gonna go over everything. Obviously, this is what all of you know and love already. So this is what it normally looks like. And then the way that this lecture is going to work is we're just going to iteratively change this PF round piece by piece into eventually becoming an APTA round so that we can really discuss the differences between PF and APTA structurally, and then we'll get into sort of a summary of the differences in norms as well as the similarities. So we'll take a PF round because there are a lot of similarities, and we'll start changing it now. So the first change that we should address is the fact that instead of doing a coin flip at the very start to assign sides and assign order, you just have a set side and a set order. So the tab website that we use will just assign you either gov or op, and it'll do so that there's a balance across prelims and across out rounds as well. So you'll be gov around 50% of the time and op around 50% of the time in any given tournament. And gov always goes first and op always goes second.
Next, we're going to be getting rid of Grand Crossfire and the Final Focus speeches. Something that I've noticed in public forum is that the Final Focuses are really just a digested down version of the summary. And so the summary becomes a lot more important in APTA rounds, especially because it is the final speech and you're not able to do more work or more weighing after the summary. Also, I've just never been a fan of Grand Cross. I think it muddles the round. I always just tell my kids to skip it whenever I'm judging. Yeah, it's just not the most productive thing. So I'm glad that the activity does not have it.
Definitely. So now that we've sort of shortened the round by the last two speeches and grand, the next kind of counterintuitive thing, I think, especially for me when I was coming into APTA, is that the order of those last two speeches are actually switched. So instead of the gov having the first summary in this case, you'd have the op give the first summary, which creates this sort of interesting thing that's sort of closer to maybe what you'd expect from policy as a format, where you have this op block that mirrors like the neg block in policy, where you have two op speeches from different speakers going directly one after another instead of having a gov speech in between them. And then gov gets the very last word at the end of the round. So they simultaneously go first in the round and also end last in the round.
Next, basically all questions that are going to be asked about the government from the opposition are coming during POC time. So this is basically a 15-minute allotted time at the beginning of every round before anybody states their case, before anybody makes any arguments, and we just know the case statement. Basically, the opposition can just ask questions to the government, clarifying the case statement, trying to maybe poke holes, but the majority of the time is going to be used writing the opposition's case. So because the opposition doesn't know what the government is going to run before the round, they have to be establishing their case during this 15-minute time period. So what this means is that during the round, crossfires do not happen, which honestly I find to be very nice because I think that also crossfires kind of muddle the round. People try to use crossfire to like make extensions or gain offense when in fact most judges aren't listening to crossfire. They're not flowing it, obviously. So I don't think it's the most productive use of a round. And instead, you're doing a lot more of that comparative during the speeches, which is a lot better, especially in terms of like establishing productive debate.
The other thing that I think people use cross for, like almost exclusively in terms of its actual function in PF, is just prep, right? Like no one is asking that many real questions that get you that many strategic changes. Like who has won a round on Crossfire that is an actual technical round? I don't remember the last time I voted on Cross. Most technical judges don't. And so what it's actually used for is prep. So fortunately, we're taking away not just cross, but also all prep. So there is no longer any prep time between any of these speeches, which might seem daunting at first, but I think is actually one of the coolest parts about APDA and parley debate in general, is that all of these speeches come immediately following the speech before it. Like, I don't know, maybe you get up, you like do that long sip of water, and then you go. But at the end of the day, there's actually no prep once the round is actually started. So that time at the very start is not just for op to ask clarifying questions about the topic, but also 15 minutes of prep, like Brooke said, that becomes that much more important because it's really the only prep that you get at the start of the round from each team. So the next thing we'll do is add time to these speeches because there's no prep time, so you can't polish like a 4-minute case for op, for example, as you would in a PF round. So we might as well add much more time so that you can at least get out the same content and the same amount of ideas, even though you haven't had the time to prep for it. So all of the speeches are extended by a very long time. And this also makes up for taking away that very last part of the round as well. So the round actually eventually adds up to around the same amount of time. It just, all of that time is used actually debating instead of a lot of the time being used for just shenanigans and like stealing prep and calling for cards and things like that. And so the new times are reflected here. Note that each of them has like a 0.5 at the end, which is a strange relic of the past of APDA. It used to be that there was a 30-second grace period in each speech. Nowadays, that grace period is just part of the speech. Everyone uses it, so it's not really a grace period by any standards. And so basically, it just is added to the end of each of these speeches. The other thing that you'll notice is that there are a few weird disparities between speech times that don't exist in PF. For instance, the PMC, which is our new name for the Gov case, it's the Prime Minister's Constructive, Prime Minister being like, the first speaker for Gov. It has 7.5 minutes, whereas the LOC, which is the Leader of Opposition's Constructive, Leader of Opposition, again, being the first speaker for op, has 8.5 minutes, so an entire extra minute on top of it. There's a few reasons for this. One is that op, is slightly structurally disadvantaged by other parts of the round, which we'll talk about later. But second is also just that there's some things that have to be balanced out so that the op speeches, especially with that block that happens later on, are able to cover a similar amount of ground that they would in a normal PF round relative to the rest of the speeches being made in the round, which is also a reason why the PMR, for example, at the very end of the round gets an additional minute relative to the LOR, which makes sense because the LOR is coming off of the heels of the MO. So there's a bunch of op content all in this one big block. And the LOR might not have as much new things to say as the PMR. After all, the LOR isn't responding to any Gov speech in between. They're just saying extra things on top of what the MO just said. Whereas the PMR does have that entire block of op arguments to also respond to, in addition to doing all the normal things you do in PF, like weighing your arguments and making ballots. Which makes sense for why they would have that slight disparity between them.
Okay, so the difference between public forum and APDA, I would say the main difference is that we're not debating a topic based on every month, right? Public forum obviously announces a new topic every 1 or 2 months, and everybody's debating the same topic. Everybody's prepping for the same topic, and everybody's on like kind of the same brainwave. APDA is like kind of the direct opposite. Everybody is on completely different, complex brainwaves that are intertwining, going weird ways. That's one of the main reasons why I think it's super cool and interesting. But basically, most tournaments that you're going to see are case, which means that every single time you are goving, you are going to be introducing a motion. So this, for example, let's use a public forum topic. We should make all illicit drugs legal. For example, the government would introduce this as their case, and the opposition would have to debate the other side of the topic. On the other hand, some tournaments use motions, which I personally prefer. It's a lot like public forum in the way that the tab room or like the upper body chooses the topic that you're debating, but it's going to be different for every single round. So for example, the way that it basically works is that everybody stands in the same room. They're going to have a slideshow playing, and they release the pairing, and then they're like, this is going to be the topic for the round. Generally, the topics are going to be a lot more balanced than cases because a lot of people read cases that are super strategic or stronger to the government side, while motions are generally supposed to be more balanced. Something that's also nice about motions is that it really does decrease the government advantage because the government technically has an infinite amount of time to be prepping a case, right? They can think of backlines, they can think of front lines, they can think of responses that the opposition are going to be making before the round even begins. While if you have a motion, you're learning it 15 minutes before the round begins, which creates a much more even playing field and is something that's also super enjoyable.
There are a few constraints on cases, however. What the most important is probably that you can't run the same case over and over again every round of the same tournament. So you have to have at least a few cases written, a few different topics that the gov is selecting, because if you do try to rerun that case, you will, like, it's not allowed by the rules, so you'll lose, or you'll just be asked to select a different case as a result. Which means that even though the gov has like infinite time for any case, like there are a lot of practical constraints that mean that they're actually spreading that prep time over a number of different cases. And also, unlike PF, there's just less of a culture of like spending every day prepping. Like I prepped so much more in PF, and even I still prep so much more in PF as a coach than I ever have in APDA. Which I think is one of the cool things about APDA is there's just less of a sort of burden of entry, like less of a barrier to entry for prepping beforehand than you have in other events like PF. So the
I
other
also know.
yeah.
Sorry, are you going to switch slides?
No, I was just going to show my casebook, but if you have something to say before that.
Just a little addition. I know that most institutions will have like a kind of novice casebook, so you don't need to feel pressured going into your first tournament to be able to write a case or to know how to structure a case, because most institutions will give you a case or two to run at a tournament. Especially because a lot of times you're going to find that you're reading 3 or 4 different cases if you make it to novice out rounds, which can be a lot, especially to write before your first tournament.
For sure. And you can always just do a motion, you know, if you don't have a case, then you can pull up this handy dandy website that might be helpful for people called Hello Motions. If you just plug this into Google, you get this. This is a website that compiles motions from tons of different tournaments, usually not APTA tournaments, but you know, the topics carry over. So for example, I could search any motions about I don't know, let's say the Arctic. That's relevant to things that we've been talking about in PF recently. So there's, you know, this is basically the PF topic, right? But also just like a lot of other types of topics that just happen to be about the Arctic. Or I could go to the motions and I could just do 10 random motions, which is really cool. So, you know, there's all of these different motions. The way that you can read these and the way that these parley motions are traditionally worded is it has a this house or th at the start. This house is just like us. I don't know. Sometimes it's specifically described. So like the way that I would use APDA or parley language in general to word the current PF topic, for example, would be like this house as the US federal government should or would substantially increase, you know, military presence in the Arctic. This house is just, you know, in that case, the US military government, because it's as the US federal government. But in general, it's just like a normative statement, right? So if I said this house believes that, I don't know, dogs are better than cats, then the arguments you would run in the round are just why dogs are better than cats or why cats are better than dogs. It's just a different term that we use as a heuristic to word our motions and our cases. Cool. The other thing that I wanted to show real quick is I have disclosed my cases. This is a, you know, an anomaly, I guess, in the community. Most people are pretty secretive about their cases for obvious strategic reasons, right? Like if other people know they're your cases, then presumably they could prep you out. I've found it to be the opposite, actually, or maybe not the opposite, but at least like not the case that people care that much or prep that much against you. After all, there's not much of a payoff. If I have like 10 cases, even if you prep out one, there's a low chance that I actually run that on you. And I'm always writing new cases. But this is, I think, a good resource to look at. So I will link this in the Facebook, and I will like toss a link in the slides, which we'll also post. And it just has a lot of different examples of different cases that I've written. For example, this one is pretty close to a PF topic, which is about US aid. So it's like US foreign aid. The topic is literally just like US foreign aid is good. It's this house supports US aid. So then the op would have to argue that US aid is bad, which is sort of a common, you know, those impact terms that are common in PF. And you can see how it's all written out like it would be in any PF case. There are, however, a few big differences that are sort of intuitive because of the fact that we're debating cases and motions. And specifically for the rest of this lecture, we're going to be talking about case debate because that's more common in most APTA tournaments. So the first one that's really intuitive is you obviously have to provide some information of what's happening in the case. Like if you choose a super niche topic, like the economics of like Libya or something, you probably need to give some background information to the op to make it a fair round, to tell them what is the economic situation in Libya, to give them some basis of facts, maybe some basis of uniqueness, as you might describe it in PF, from which you can then create some difference. Which means that there's no more cards in the round, because it would be totally unfair. Like, first of all, how would you even do that, right? Like, if you're the op, you're not going to like go cut cards during POC time. Instead, you're just going to be thinking of actual logical arguments. And it also means that the gov can't use any cards, because obviously that would be crazy unfair. Like if the gov just spent like all of their time like cutting a bunch of evidence and like studies that said like, oh, there's a 60% chance that if we pass this policy, it's going to like cure cancer or something, then the op would just not be able to contest that, because the gov would just be like, oh, no matter how many theoretical reasons there is for why this policy is bad, like we actually have empirical evidence that it's good. And so then the op would always get stomped on, which means that the gov isn't allowed to bring up specific information like cards or something like that. They can, however, bring up like illustrative examples. They just can't be like the entirety of your argument, which I think is pretty common in PF, where like these days, especially, every single word out of your mouth is like a 50% chance it's a card. And you use cards to state every like claim that you make. Is just not the case at all in APDA, which I think is better, because it means that the actual amount of warranting instead, which is absent from a lot of cards in PF, becomes the primary focus of the debate.
Could not reiterate that more. Basically, there are two ways that you can go about an opposition. The vast majority of teams, and I think the most strategic way to do a round, as a person who has unfortunately read a lot of tight calls in their novice year, is by straight opping a case. So what that basically means is just taking the opposition, debating it as the opposition, just debating the other side of the topic, nothing like super crazy to it. The other way of doing it is if you are 100% sure the opposition does not exist, or it requires you to defend something like racism or like homophobia, things like that. If it's like objectively incorrect to be debating the opposition, or if it hurts some sort of group of people to be debating the opposition, then you could read a tight call. So basically what that does is it says that the opposition is undebatable. And then basically the sides flip. So starting with the member of government speech, the government is going to have to give the potential opposition that they could have gave in the last speech. If they win, the opposition, or actually there are different interpretations of how this works. If the gov wins with the arguments that could be presented by the opposition, then that means the case is oppable, right? Which means the op would theoretically lose the round. But basically, you're putting the round on the line of whether or not the opposition is debatable, which can be very challenging to like convince, especially because if there is some like niche argument that exists on a topic, then like the government could theoretically win on it. So it's not very strategic to be reading tight calls. Also, most teams, if their cases are tight or like very hard to debate the other side of, will have a pre-written tight block, which means that they'll basically have pre-written arguments that the opposition could have run, just in case they do face a tight call.
And I do want to be clear, this is not just like a theory shell like it would be in PF, right? You don't just say like, A is the interpretation, debaters must not write like cases that are unfair, and then also go about debating it normally. There are sort of intuitive reasons for this, why you wouldn't both straight op and tight call, right? Like if you win the tight call, the straight op is false. If you win the straight op, then the tight call is false. So you're putting, I guess, either yourself or the gov, depending on how you look at it, in like an impossible double bind. So you have to pick one of them. They do directly trade off with each other. I've seen it a few times where novices will try to tight call at the top, sort of like softly. They'll be like, this is super unfair. You should, drop them because it's unfair, but we'll try our best. But you really can't do both, because you're just, in an impossible situation where you thread the needle, and you just can't do that. So if you do commit to tight calling, you really do have to commit, and you have to decide that before you hopefully start the round, before at least you start the LOC. And the entirety of the rest of the round flips after that. There's no going back, basically. And both tight calls and another type of sort of more theoretical argument, which is called a spec call, which is intuitive. It's just the gov has brought up a ton of specific information we couldn't have known that wasn't in background. These are both ways of limiting the incredible advantage that gov gets from being able to select both the topic and what side they're on in the topic. So there are different avenues that op can use to call the gov out for doing things that are unfair, given that they have the ability to select the topic. Another thing that corrects this a little bit is that there are a lot of cases that are op choice, meaning that gov will sometimes select a case that allows the op to choose the side, even if the gov is selecting the topic, which I think is a good norm, and some tournaments even require it, but it's pretty rare.
Okay. Something that's also important is that, so PMC is the one who's introducing new offense for the government. The opposition is also introducing new offense for the opposition, right? Because that's the first opposition speech. Something that's also really important and is not true of public forum is that the member of opposition gets to give new responses to the PMC in their speech. This is super important, especially because you could basically be reading, I can't do math, 17 minutes of offense in the opposition given those first two speeches, right? Because everything you say in the MO does not have to be an extension of the LOC. They can be completely different arguments that you make and be completely different ways that you get offense on the flow. It's not always the most strategic thing to be reading completely different offense. I think it is strategic to be reading some new offense, but you should be using that some of that time doing weighing on previous responses. But basically, if you use the opposition correctly, it can skew very heavily in your favor, especially following the op block, following the MO and the LOR. If you basically have 17 minutes of offense on the flow that the PMR is forced to cover, it makes their job basically impossible. So as long as you do it strategically, it really can balance out that like super heavy gov skew.
And I think if we talk about this in PF terms, it becomes even more clear. Like, okay, so LOC, unlike just a normal like neg case, it's much longer, obviously, even longer than the gov case, and it has different purposes and different abilities as well. Unlike in PF, which I think is kind of regrettable, but unlike in PF, the second constructive in PF does not respond to the first constructive, but LOC definitely responds to PMC. So the LOC in its entirety, and this is kind of intuitive because you don't have anything prepped beforehand unless you've like prepped a ton of offense in the POC time. All of it is set up sort of relative to the PMC from the get-go. So instead of just making it comparative later in the round, it starts out being comparative. And so you can start out with things like weighing in the LOC. You can start out with just you go line by lining the PMC, or any number of things like that. And then the MO afterwards is able to function almost as like an incredibly OP like second summary type speech, where you can, you don't have to extend anything, but you do have the ability to give another rebuttal to the PMC, to the original AF case, to fill in any gaps that your LOC left behind, or you can just backline all of the responses that your LOC gave, or you can also like give new responses to the MG, or you could just give entirely new offense. Like the MO has the opportunity to just set up new contention level arguments as well. This is risky because obviously PMR gets new responses to those and you can't answer PMR. So they might just be able to be like, oh, 3 responses, this is nonsense. And then the judge has to credit those responses. But there's just like an incredible ceiling that's very, very high of different things that you can do in MO. You can kind of just do whatever the heck you want strategically, which makes it a very powerful speech. And I guess I kind of just mentioned this. It's obviously true of the member speeches, which is the member of government, the MG, and the member of opposition, the MO, because they're kind of like, they function sort of like rebuttals in the PF sense, that they don't need to extend arguments. But it's actually also true of every speech in the round, including the very last ones. So whereas in PF, you would expect summary and final focus have to extend all of their arguments to the T, in APDA, you still probably should to some extent, but there isn't the same technical requirement. And to be clear about what I mean about that, right? Like you obviously need to explain to the judge what the judge should be voting on, right? You should ideally be like, remember this argument in LOC that was this argument and it's good and it outweighs their argument and we win it. But it's slightly different in that the judges will not drop your arguments if you are trying to win off of the argument, but you like miss a warrant in the extension or something like that. You don't have to completely remake the wheel like you do in PF. So there's no judge who, like, if you really collapse on an argument and you make it clear that you are collapsing on the argument, no judge is going to be like, oh, well, I almost voted for you, but you didn't extend like the second line of the argument, or you didn't extend like the impact, and therefore I couldn't. Like, if you do weighing on it and you explain that this is the argument that you are going for, and they know where it is on their flow, they will fill in that extension for you, which I think is really nice, because it means that instead of like, a lot of times in summary, you focus like 45 seconds on just re-explaining all of your arguments, when you could be using all of this time like actually doing the technical nitty-gritty that is new in summary and that helps you win the round. And so in APDA, we focus the entirety of these speeches on those things. The other explanation that I think makes this very clear is, although you definitely want to bring up these arguments again, if they are conceded, for example, you can just be like, look, this argument was entirely conceded. And then if you don't explain it like step 1, step 2, step 3, all the way through again, the judge won't care. It's conceded. So if you just weigh it, then you'll be able to win on the argument, even if you don't completely re-explain it. It is helpful, like in like a just explanatory and clarity sense, to re-explain some things, but it's just not a technical requirement in the same way.
Agreed. Okay. I think this is like one of the most annoying parts of APDA, if not the only thing that really does get on my nerves about APDA, but there are these things called POOs, or points of order. Basically any time during the LOR or the PMR, your opponent can raise their hand or say POO. And that basically means that you stop your speech and the opponent will point out something new that you said in those speeches on the flow. So I would like to make it very clear, you cannot say anything new in the LOR or the PMR. If you do, your opponent will probably be listening and will catch you. If it is new and the judge evaluates it as a new argument, it will get scratched off the flow. But most judges will only like evaluate whether or not something is new if you call it out. So you have to be listening very closely to your opponent's speeches and calling out POOs. And then after like the judge evaluates it, both sides explain how it's new or not new. The speech continues. Time stops, like obviously.
I am a soft advocate of POs. I don't know. Like, just to play devil's advocate for a second, I do think one of the most important, like one of the most annoying things about PF is like when you have like an inexperienced judge and then second final focus gets up and just says like totally new stuff. Like they give like new responses to your argument that you couldn't answer before, and you just can't do anything. You just have to sit there and shake your head. But in APDA, you can actually act upon it. You can be like, actually, this was new. Pause your time real quick. Let's work this out. And unfortunately, like the issue is that sometimes it gets into annoying, like, you know, side debates, and the judge has to keep it under control. Like where like I'm like, oh, this was totally new, and you're like, no, it wasn't new at all. I'm like, yes, it actually was new, and the definition of new is this, and they're like, no, we have a different definition of new, and the judge is like, settle down, I'll figure it out myself with my paradigm, and I will determine if it's new. But it is just a useful way of just like flagging something that might be new for the judge to evaluate themselves. Okay, cool. So the next like section of this lecture is just a bunch of the overall like summary of ways that the speeches themselves are different from PF speeches. I want to emphasize more the similarities than the differences, to be honest, because I think there are more similarities than there are differences, but we will talk about the differences as well. Most of the differences, especially in like norms of speeches and in judging, I think are positive differences. But it's up to you to determine. Obviously, everyone has their own preferences. So the first question is, who is judging you? In PF, obviously, it could be like anyone. Could be my mom, which is kind of scary. Or it could be like, you know, one of us, or like a coach who has a lot of experience. It's sort of a mixed bag, right? You always look at the judge pool and you like figure out how many people have paradigms, and you try to strike people who don't have paradigms, or you strike people who have like crazy technical like policy paradigms that you might not understand as much, or who just seem like they would vote on like crazy arguments. Like maybe your opponent might run tricks and you're worried about that, so you will like strike a judge who will vote on tricks. You know, everyone has their own thresholds for determining this stuff, and every judge is pretty dogmatic. The difference in APDA is that everyone judging you is someone who either is currently a debater or who has previously done debate, and specifically APDA debate. in order to even qualify as being a judge, you have to have competed at at least a handful of APDA tournaments, which means you have to have known about APDA. So that's the interesting thing about APDA in general, is that it's all student led. Like there aren't really many like adult coaches in the process who are like regulating everything or like requiring something to happen. And it's not like your parents are coming in to judge for you. So it's other college students who are judging and who are often hosting the tournaments as well. And I think this is a really good thing because it means you just have way fewer like judge screws in like the traditional sense, because everyone at least understands intuitively what like offense and defense are, for example, and what weighing is and things like that, which is at least a bare minimum that you don't find in PF.
You want to go on tech versus truth?
Yeah, sure. So for tech versus truth, I think the biggest misconception about APDA coming from PF is that APDA is just like some sort of weird, like layified circuit PF. For some reason, this was my perception when I came into APDA. I was like scared that it was just going to be like super lay, like, oh, it's Parley, so it must be completely different. But really, I think in some ways, APDA is even more technical than circuit PF. Like certainly there are some things that people do in circuit PF that would not fly as well in APDA. Like the whole norm of moving towards like crazy theory arguments is like okay, like the people debate this all the time, right? Like whether or not things like I don't know, like especially the Frib theory, right? Like people are winning on things like shoe theory now, not constantly, but they're doing it. And things like open source disclosure, you must disclose in this particular way. All of these things are pretty much absent from APDA as just a norm. They aren't like strictly absent. Like I'm sure if you did run these things, you might be able to find a judge who might vote for them. But it would probably be a lot more difficult. And I think this is one way that a lot of people see APDA from a PF perspective, and they're like, oh, it's like totally not technical at all. But honestly, this is like the only way in which I think anyone could consider it less technical than PF. And I think this is actually a perfectly defensible way, because why the heck would you run all of these like crazy frivolous arguments that none of you believe about theory when you could just write like cases about anything? Like you could actually debate about anything you want. Like there's no reason to do things like always go for like paraphrase theory. There's no evidence to be paraphrased. There's no like evidence ethics violations in the first place. All of the norms are already like, I don't know. It's much harder to make norm making arguments that are very convincing, because I think that, first of all, a lot fewer people do like really bad things with the norms. And second, like, again, you have so much freedom in APDA that it just doesn't make as much sense to run these kinds of squirrely arguments. The rest of debate, I think, APDA is just much more clearly tech over truth compared to PF. Like not only do you have judges who are more likely to be tech over truth, but you also just like have the norms of being able to always run sort of whatever arguments you want. I think that the fact that you can select whatever topic you want sort of entrenches this. Like I can select a topic about like a fictional universe, or a topic about like, I don't know, nuclear weapons or like anything I want to. And because of that, you can make infinite universes. You can talk about anything you want. So arguments that you never could possibly imagine in PF suddenly can become very relevant and suddenly can become like easy arguments for you to win, even if they seem like crazy from a PF perspective, that are something that like a PF judge would never ever vote for. And we'll like get into some examples of that kind of stuff later. And then the final thing is just speed. Like I think this is the other thing that PFers misunderstand, which is that they think that APDA is just like very much like rhetorically based. And to some extent, every event is, but it's not any more rhetorically based than PF. And the norms of things like speed are pretty much the same, if not having like a lower threshold for evaluating high speed. There obviously isn't the same ability to spread, because by and large, you're not reading off of a computer. So it's harder to like actually do the kind of spreading that you see in events like policy or sometimes at the circuit PF level. But at the same time, the speed that you can get up to is something that is like something that most judges can follow and something that is more accepted, just not at the most extreme level, which I think is still the case in PF anyway.
Agreed.
Do you have any other comments on judging norms in general? This obviously isn't like a comprehensive list.
I honestly just think the judging is like substantially better. Um, like you will still have those judges where you're like, oh, it's a screw, but like I find that a lot more times like decisions are a lot more justifiable. Also something that's super nice is that judges disclose like pretty consistently at every single tournament. Like it's pretty rare that you won't get disclosure and you won't get an RFD, which is definitely something that's really appreciated.
Yeah, definitely. And the RFDs are pretty in depth too. Uh,
Agreed.
and like I don't think I've had any judge ever, maybe like one or two, that like didn't understand the arguments I was making, which I think was like a endemic problem in PF when I debated.
Oh, 100%.
So at the very least, they will follow you, which is very good. I didn't even write this slide, but I think that this is like a rant that I've been wanting to make for a while, which is that like I think more than any other debate event that I've ever tried or ever heard of, APDA is just so freeing as an event. Like you can really talk about anything. Like I think the utter infiniteness of what you can talk about is actually really overwhelming at times, but really, really, really special for debate. Like I think the reason that I do debate is to sort of intellectually, I don't know, investigate different topics and also just like play this little game that we play, which is really fun. And with APTA, you can do that with anything. Like you actually have like a captive audience for an entire hour to talk about anything in the world that you want to talk about. Like you could like make a case about bionicles. You can make a case about like, I don't know, gender theory. You can make a case about like which class you should take in the next semester, or relationships, or geology, or anything. It could literally be anything that you might have any interest in. For example, if you go to my casebook, I've got like a lot of the traditional PF stuff. I've got like US foreign aid. I've even got some PF topics in there, like legalization of drugs. But I've also got like, you should fight to the death against one horse-sized duck instead of 100 duck-sized horses, and like other cases about like, the movie Ratatouille, and whether or not you should take the rat up on its deal to like sit on your head and like puppeteer you into cooking. And things like the Avatar: The Last Airbender universe and a particular decision that happened in there. And this is like kind of the vibe of APTA is like you get your handful of serious cases, and I think they're even wider than the ones that you have in PF because I think a lot of PFers get frustrated that they can't talk about important issues like race and gender, but you can in APTA. Like you can do whatever you want. You can talk about those issues as extensively and in whatever context that you want to talk about those things, and about like change in general. And you can even talk about like norms. Like you don't have to run a theory argument to talk about the norms of the debate space. It's actually quite easier because you can talk about it in the form of a case. Like you can run a meta case that's about like how APTA should be, or how debate should be, or how to interpret debate. Or you could like just go completely off the rails and just talk about whatever the heck you want. It's like the world is your oyster, and APTA, I just think, epitomizes that ability to do that, which is really, really fun. And on the flip side, on the off, you get to hear and be humbled by like these people who are really passionate about all sorts of different topics you've never even heard of, and you're able to really hone that skill that I think is so valuable, of being able to really intellectually engage in all of these different topics, just on the spot with like 15 minutes of preparation. And maybe it's slightly difficult for you at first, but it really doesn't take that much to start to get to that point where it really just feels like PF again, and then you can just go. There's nothing holding you back anymore. You don't have to think about like, oh, is the judge going to agree with my argument? Like, no, you just make the argument, and chances are the judge will take it at face value. I think that is a freedom that you get only from APTA, in my experience.
I have to add, I'm not gonna lie, I have been in APTA for 1 year. I was a novice this past year, and it was the most educational experience of my entire life. Everybody in APTA is so smart and has the most interesting perspectives and ideas, and having the opportunity to listen to these perspectives and to learn from other people has been the most amazing experience of my entire life, honestly, because even after rounds, like people get into these really in-depth discussions about like whether or not like the government or the opposition is correct, like in a theoretical world. Like it's actually fostering educational discussions, which I don't think is really true of PF, right? Like I think in a lot of cases, people are just reading off of docs, not actually engaging with arguments, don't actually care about the arguments they're debating, and they aren't actually like it's a very theoretical world that is public forum. It's like in this theoretical world where we do pass this policy, I don't think people are actually thinking about the world at which we do experience the policy being implemented, right? I think APDA is just so fundamentally different because it's things that people care about, right? Like you are engaging with things that people experience on the everyday basis or think about on an everyday basis. And also the people are just so smart. Like everybody who goes to these schools that compete in APDA are very well educated, very well versed in like different types of literature and different issues, and generally just have like the most interesting perspectives on life.
Yeah, I don't know. It's cool. I could probably rant about this for like hours,
Agreed,
but
but
it's
we shouldn't.
we highly encourage you to try APDA. So
Yes.
this is just another sort of like explanation of what I think APDA does really well that PF doesn't. And the intention of this is like, and this slide is non-exhaustive as well. You should ask yourself, what are the things you dislike about PF? Like presumably if you're coming from PF and you've done a lot of PF, you like PF on net. But certainly there are things you wish were different about PF. I think a lot of those, at least for me, when I was a PFer, one was like obviously evidence ethics. Like I just didn't. First of all, I didn't have very good evidence ethics until like my junior or senior year. So I think that made it difficult to take myself seriously. To be honest, I wasn't really believing my arguments that much, and also like other people just have terrible evidence ethics. Like I swear, I think the one saving grace of the wiki is that it really has opened my eyes to just how terrible everyone's evidence ethics are. Like I've prepped out some cases on the wiki, and just reading through like literally any card, like I could actually find any card. There's like a 99% chance that there's something wrong with how it is cut. And that's just like, I don't know. It's just so annoying to me because isn't the whole point that you learn something from the research? Like what even is the point of the research if you're not learning anything? And so many of the rounds get into this kind of stuff, just like people calling for cards back and forth and being like, oh, well, your evidence actually isn't as methodologically sound because the conclusion said that it didn't control for this variable. It's like, I don't care. Like none of this matters to my education of what is actually happening in the round. I don't care about your statistics or why yours post-dates mine by 1 week. I just think all of that should just be gotten rid of. And I think, maybe it's extreme to just not have any evidence, but APTA does the best thing where you can have whatever facts that you want to be there in the background, and you can cite examples. You can still bring in knowledge that you have about the topic from outside and thus educate yourself as a result. But you don't have the same squabble over evidence that I think is just so annoying in PF. You also just have much less judge intervention, I think. Like on the one hand, I think a lot of technical judges do unfortunately intervene on evidence. Like they will like read your evidence and they'll be like, actually, I have a different interpretation of this evidence. And you don't even get a chance to defend your interpretation of the evidence. It's just like annoying. And then on the other hand, obviously like lay judges or people who are less experienced or even other technical judges, to be completely honest, they have like such dogmatic paradigms. They will just completely vote for one side or the other based on like, their own preconceived notions, which obviously will happen to some extent in any debate event, but it's just much less of a thing in APTA. And you can also control how much of a thing this is by just running topics that the judges are less likely to have preconceived notions about, things like that, which I don't think you can do as much in PF. And finally,
talking
yeah,
about
go for it.
Okay. So for community toxicity, I personally had a very bad experience in public forum regarding community toxicity, especially like a lot of sexism, a lot of like really negative experiences that I also heard from other people regarding their identities. APTA is so different. There are not prep groups. I think the circuit is majority gender minority. I think that's like a fair statement to be saying. There's also like a lot of representation because like schools generally in the Northeast have lots of representation and have a lot more encouragement for people who are like minorities in their communities to be joining certain clubs, especially like debate. Also, I think it's just much more conducive to like a non-toxic environment. Everybody's a lot more like engaging with each other's topics. There's a lot less anger. I feel like there's a lot of anger surrounding like whether or not you pick up a round. Like I don't think people care as much genuinely. I think that a lot of people are there because they enjoy the social aspects of it and the educational aspects of it much more than they care about winning or losing a round. I've also found that this has like substantially decreased my anxiety associated with the activity. public forum has always been so stressful for me, especially when I've been competing. While on the other hand, like APDA is just so much more like an engaging, positive environment. Um, I've also found that I went to a really small school for public forum, and I didn't really have that great of a support base. If you go to like a relatively established APTA school, which is a lot of schools, you will have an amazing support base. I can confidently say that.
And honestly, even if you don't, like people in APTA, I don't know, like they will actively reach out to you, which is really
Agreed.
nice. Like we have like group chats with like almost like everyone who competes in APTA has like is like just in a group chat together where they just talk about stuff. Or we have like the forum, for example, on the APTA website where anyone who is on APTA can just engage in discussions with each other. There are a couple anecdotes that I'll give that I think really illustrate this. One is like there have been tournaments that I went to where like, you know, many of them will just have socials after the first day of the tournament. So like before you even know who's like broken or anything, you've already debated a few rounds of prelims. Like one of them in Washington, D.C., we just like all went to like the Washington Monument at like 11 p.m. and all hung out together with like, you know, so many people from all these different teams, people who you just debated, people who you would go on to debate the next day, all just like, you know, vibing, which is something that I just never saw in PF. Like, you know, some people, they develop friendship circles in PF, but even those are kind of weird, you know, they're like, there really are circles, you know, they're
Mhm.
pretty rigid. But in APTA, you just hang out with people because they're people. The other anecdote I'll give is that on the forum, which I mentioned earlier, we do like games sometimes. Like this summer, for example, we have this long-standing tradition of doing a game of Werewolf, which is like the game Mafia, if anyone has ever played it, where you know everyone's roles are secret. Some people are like on the werewolf team and they like kill someone every night. We did it on the forum where every day in the game was a day in real life, and every night in the game was a night in real life. So it took like over 2 weeks, and we all like were strategizing together in these forums and stuff. It was so fun. I did this with like so many people who I've, you know, just now meeting on the forum, who I haven't debated before, or people who I have debated and I know like inside and out. I know like all of their cases and all of their topic preferences and stuff. And that's just like a really cool thing. Like we're just doing something entirely separate from debate that is just all of us being a community together in a pretty cool way. And I've met, you know, obviously some of my best friends in college through APTA as well, which I think is something that sometimes happens in NPF, but just is associated with so much more drama that is, I think, readily
Agreed.
avoidable. Um, and obviously, it's not completely separate from any drama. I think any social situation with people who are in a competitive environment, you know, has this, but it's just a completely different world than PF. It's so much less toxic than PF in a way that I never thought debate even inherently could be. So I don't know. I think there are a lot of reasons that you should try to get involved in APTA. So then this is the question of how do you then do that? If you are convinced by all of our rants about why APTA is so cool, the next step for you is probably one, to try to reach out to your school's APTA team if it has one. Notably, if it doesn't have an APTA team, there are plenty of resources for you to start an APTA team. Either way, you should probably go to this website, apta.online. I already, oh my gosh, it automatically goes to the forum for me. That's kind of embarrassing. And here, let me just go to the actual homepage instead of
Really bad.
and you'll see this website. So this is the APTA homepage website. There are all these different committees. You know, expansion committee is probably relevant for people who don't have an established APTA team and are looking to get involved. You can also just like DM any of the people whose names you see in here. Like there's a whole meet the board portion, and all of these people, I don't know. I think both Brooke and I know them all personally, and they are very welcoming to anyone who might want to help out. You can also just DM either of us personally, and we can help you find different resources for getting involved. And you can see all of the different like standings, the results schedule, videos of other past rounds and things like that, and different resources for novices. So this is a good website you should know about. The forum also has a lot of discourse about like norms and you know, different, I don't know, debate nerd stuff that you might imagine, which is pretty cool. And that's one good way of getting involved. So I would definitely reach out to people in the community, ideally reach out to your team if you have one, and get familiar with this website and other resources that we'll be putting out. Any other, pieces of advice for how to get involved?
I don't think so. Yeah. Thank y'all for coming, or thank y'all for watching. Mac and I obviously very much enjoy the activity. We also loved public forum, but I can confidently say like APDA has been a lot more rewarding for me, and I really enjoy it. It's definitely like a good use of your time in college, especially because it's not super heavy on the workload. A lot of teams are super flexible with how much you compete, how much you engage within the team. Overall, I just think it's really great, especially to help with that transition from like public forum, especially if you debated a lot, to like not debating at all can be kind of shocking. It helps fill time, I'll say that. But yeah, it's great.
Yeah, at the very least, I would, give it a shot, see if you like it, see if it's for you. And we hope that it is. And if there's anything that we can do to make it more for you, we would love to know. Okay, see you everyone. So I'm going to end the recording here.